One bad cop. One wrongful arrest. One woman who refused to back down. This is the story of Naomi Carter, a decorated officer who became the target of a corrupt system. Dragged from her car, humiliated, and thrown into a cell, her only crime? Daring to question authority. But what happened next? She turned the tables. You won't believe how this fight for justice ends. Where are you watching from? Did this story make you feel angry, inspired, or both? If you love stories of justice and resilience, subscribe to Inspiring Stories Told Now. More powerful stories are coming your way. The rain pounded against the windshield, each drop slamming down like a drumbeat against the night. The highway stretched ahead, dark and slick, the faded white lines barely visible under the harsh glare of passing headlights. Naomi Carter tightened her grip on the wheel, exhaustion creeping into her muscles as she rolled her shoulders, trying to shake the tension out of her body. She had been on the road for nearly 3 hours, making her way back to Jackson from an intelligence briefing in Biloxi. The event had run long, full of bureaucratic discussions and policy updates that had left her mentally drained. Normally, she'd welcome the solitude of a late-night drive, letting the low hum of smooth jazz from her speakers ease the weight of the day. But tonight felt different. There was something about the darkness pressing in around her, the way the rain distorted the road, the silence of the empty stretch of highway. It unsettled her. Then it happened. Flashing red and blue lights exploded in her rearview mirror, cutting through the night like a blade. Naomi's heart clenched. Not here. Not now. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay calm. This wasn't the first time she'd been pulled over, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. She had seen it before, the way officers' eyes lingered on her a little too long when she pulled up in her sleek black sedan. A black woman in a nice car, alone, on a Mississippi highway? She might as well have painted a target on her back. Still, she did everything right. She flicked her turn signal on, eased her car onto the shoulder, and shifted into park. The rain continued its relentless assault, blurring the world outside as her wipers worked overtime. Naomi took a deep breath, placed both hands on the wheel, and waited. Seconds stretched into a minute. Then 2. The officer was stalling on purpose. Naomi watched in the mirror as the white patrol car idled behind her, its lights still flashing, illuminating the wet pavement like a crime scene waiting to happen. A power move. When the driver's side door finally swung open, a figure stepped out, slow, deliberate, boots crunching against the wet asphalt. Sergeant Riggins. Naomi had never met him, but she knew his type. Swaggering. Overconfident. The kind of man who saw his badge as a crown and the people on the other side of it as subjects to control. She swallowed the familiar bitterness rising in her throat. Stay calm. Get through it. Riggins approached her window, his flashlight beaming directly into her eyes. It was unnecessary, obnoxious, but she didn't flinch. License and registration, he barked. No greeting, no explanation. Just authority wrapped in arrogance. Naomi blinked against the light, her voice steady. May I ask why I was stopped, officer? Riggins smirked, lowering the flashlight just enough for her to see the amusement in his eyes. He was enjoying this. License and registration, he repeated, slow and deliberate, like he was speaking to a child. Naomi forced herself not to react. Instead, she moved with precision, reaching into her glove compartment and pulling out the requested documents. She extended them toward him, her fingers steady. Riggins snatched them from her hand, barely glancing at them before his eyes flicked back to hers. Taillights out, he said flatly. Naomi frowned. That's not possible. I had my car inspected last week. Riggins' smirk deepened. You calling me a liar, ma'am? The way he said, ma'am, dripped with condescension, like it was an insult instead of a formality. Naomi knew this game. He expected her to shrink, to apologize, to make herself small. She had seen men like him overseas in interrogation rooms, in back alleys where power was a currency and fear was the exchange rate. She straightened her shoulders. I'm simply saying I know my vehicle is in working order. The air between them tightened. "Step out of the car," Riggins ordered. Naomi's pulse quickened. Too fast. She had barely spoken, barely questioned him, and he was already escalating. "For what reason?" she asked, her voice even. Riggins took a step closer, his smirk vanishing. "Because I said so." A spike of anger flared in Naomi's chest, hot and sharp. "Not here. Not now." She glanced toward the road. No witnesses. No cameras. Just the rain and the darkness and a man who was far too comfortable abusing his power. Still, she complied. This wasn't the time to fight. She unbuckled her seatbelt, opened the door, and stepped out. The cold air hit her like a slap, the rain soaking into her sweater almost instantly. Riggins stepped forward, scanning her. His eyes flicked over her trim, athletic build, the way she carried herself. Not like a woman who was afraid, but one who had seen worse. He didn't like that. "Turn around." "Hands on the car," he ordered. Naomi hesitated. "For what reason?" Riggins' face darkened. "Are you resisting?" She clenched her jaw. "No. I'm asking a question." A flicker of something passed through his eyes, annoyance, amusement, a challenge. Then, without warning, he grabbed her wrist. Naomi reacted on instinct, stepping back just enough to avoid his grip, her heart slamming against her ribs. Under arrest for obstruction, Riggins snapped, pulling out his handcuffs. Naomi's stomach dropped. So that was his game. She had two choices: comply and fight this later, or push back and risk becoming another name in a headline. Slowly, deliberately, she turned and placed her hands on the roof of her car. The metal was cold beneath her palms, grounding her, steadying her. She felt Riggins step closer, his breath too warm against the back of her neck. The handcuffs bit into her wrists, too tight, intentional. She sucked in a sharp breath, but didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. As he yanked her toward the patrol car, his grip bruising, he leaned in and whispered, "Welcome to Jackson, sweetheart. Hope you like concrete beds." Naomi clenched her fists. Her blood boiled, her pulse pounded, but she swallowed it all down. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The moment Naomi stepped into the station, the stench of sweat, old coffee, and something deeper, something rotten, hit her like a wave. It was the kind of place where the walls had soaked in decades of corruption, where the floors were stained with the stories of people who never walked back out the same. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting shadows that danced along the cracked tile. The room was too cold, too quiet, save for the soft murmur of officers going about their routines. Business as usual. Sergeant Kyle Riggins marched her through the front, his grip still too tight on her arm. She didn't flinch. She refused to give him that satisfaction. Behind the desk sat a bored-looking sergeant, his guts spilling over his belt, eyes barely glancing up as Riggins shoved Naomi forward. "Another one, huh?" the man muttered, already reaching for the booking forms. Naomi clenched her jaw. Another one. That's what she was to them. Not a person, not a decorated officer. Just another black woman shoved through the system. Riggins dropped her paperwork onto the desk, smirking. "Special case. She thinks she's above the law." The desk sergeant barely reacted. They all do. Naomi's stomach twisted. It wasn't what they said, it was how they said it. Flat. Casual. Routine. They had done this so many times, it no longer required thought. Her hands burned as they yanked the cuffs off, the bruises already forming around her wrists. A younger officer, maybe mid-20s, hesitated slightly as he reached for the fingerprint scanner. He didn't meet her eyes. Naomi exhaled sharply. They all knew this was wrong, but no one would stop it. The cold ink spread across her fingertips, smearing onto the scanner. One press, then another. Mechanical, systematic, dehumanizing. Next came the mugshot. She was led to a cracked white wall, a flickering camera mounted above. The officer taking the photo didn't bother adjusting the lighting or making sure she was centered. Just a quick snap, another number in their system. The flash burned her eyes for a second, and when the white spots cleared, she was greeted by the reflection of herself on the small computer monitor. A black woman. Strong. Defiant. Unbroken. For now. The younger officer cleared his throat. Shoes and personal belongings, he said quietly, holding out a plastic evidence bag. Naomi kicked off her heels, peeled off her jewelry, and placed everything inside. The weight of it, the wedding band she no longer wore, the delicate chain her grandmother had given her, felt heavier than it should. Then came the final step. Riggins' smirk returned. "Enjoy your stay, Miss Special Agent," he taunted. Naomi didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't break. Instead, she leaned in just slightly, voice calm, controlled. "You have no idea what you've done." For the first time, Riggins' smile faltered. But it was gone as quickly as it came. He leaned in closer, so near she could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "No one's coming for you," he whispered, voice laced with mock sympathy. "Not tonight." Something in Naomi's chest tightened. Not because she believed him, not because she was afraid, but because she knew, in this town, in this system, he could be right. For now, the cell door slammed shut, the lock clicking into place. Naomi stood still, listening as Riggins' boots faded down the hall. She turned. The cell was small, claustrophobic. A single metal bench jutted out from the wall, slick with condensation from the humidity. A rust-stained toilet sat in the corner. No blanket, no pillow, just cold steel and concrete. She had been in far worse places before. She had endured war zones, interrogations, hostile foreign territories. But this was different. This was her own country. Naomi lowered herself onto the bench, pressing her palms against the chilled metal, willing herself to breathe. Hours passed. The station was eerily quiet, save for the occasional drunken shout from another holding cell down the corridor. Her wrists ached. Her back throbbed from the hard bench. She tried to keep her thoughts sharp, but the silence gnawed at her. Riggins' words echoed in her head. "No one's coming for you." What if he was right? What if the system swallowed her whole before anyone realized she was missing? Her stomach clenched. She had seen it happen before. Time dragged. No phone call. No explanations. Just waiting. Then, footsteps. Naomi stiffened, expecting Riggins, but it wasn't him. It was a younger officer, maybe early 30s, sharp features but hesitant steps. His uniform was crisp, his name tag slightly askew. He looked nervous. He stopped just outside the bars, shifting on his feet. Ma'am." His voice was quiet. Naomi slowly lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes. You might want to sit tight," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Something's happening." Naomi's pulse jumped. She studied him carefully. He wasn't mocking her. He was warning her. Hope flickered, small, fragile, but real. Something was happening. The officer hesitated like he wanted to say more. Then, a sharp voice from down the hall called his name. His back straightened instantly. He threw one last glance at Naomi, then turned and disappeared down the corridor. The silence felt different now. Something had shifted. She wasn't alone in this fight. Somebody knew she was here. And soon, the whole damn world would too. What would you do if you were in Naomi's shoes? Falsely arrested, humiliated, and locked away with no one to call for help? The fear, the rage, the injustice. It's real, and it happens every day. Naomi refuses to break, but she needs your support. Like this video if you stand with her. Comment below. Should Riggins face real consequences? And don't stop watching now, because what happens next will change everything. Justice is coming, but the fight isn't over. Stay tuned for the next part, where the truth begins to unravel and the battle for justice truly begins. The air inside Jackson County Courthouse was thick with tension, the kind that made even the most seasoned officials shift uncomfortably in their seats. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and all eyes turned toward the woman stepping through. Naomi Carter. She was no longer in handcuffs, no longer in a cold, dark cell. Instead, she walked in with her head held high, shoulders squared, exuding an aura of quiet power. She wore a navy blue blazer, crisp slacks, and a simple white blouse, sharp, professional, composed. The murmurs started the moment she entered. The reporters scribbled notes, cameras flashed, and even the bailiff's gaze lingered on her just a little longer than necessary. Because everyone in that room knew exactly who she was now. And more importantly, they knew what had been done to her. On the other side of the courtroom, Sergeant Kyle Riggins was already seated at the defendant's table. He didn't look as smug now. His usual arrogant stance was replaced with stiff shoulders and a clenched jaw. His lawyer sat beside him, whispering something, but Riggins wasn't listening. His gaze flickered up to meet Naomi's, and for the first time, there was something uncertain in his eyes. Naomi didn't smirk, didn't gloat. She didn't need to, because today, she wasn't the one on trial. The judge entered, Judge Matthew Holloway, an older man with weary eyes and a sharp mind. He adjusted his glasses, sighing as he shuffled through the case files. "All right," he muttered, already sounding impatient. "Let's get to it." The prosecutor, a sharp, no-nonsense black woman named Vanessa Grayson, stood, clearing her throat. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, controlled, but edged with something cold. "We have reason to believe that the defendant, Sergeant Kyle Riggins, conducted an unlawful arrest, fabricated charges, and used excessive force against my client, Lieutenant Naomi Carter. Furthermore," she continued, flipping through a thick folder, "we have substantial evidence that this is not an isolated incident." Riggins visibly tensed. His lawyer whispered something urgently, but he didn't respond. Judge Holloway peered at him over his glasses. "Sergeant Riggins," he said, his tone heavy, already filled with doubt. "Do you have an explanation for this?" Riggins straightened, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, the defendant was uncooperative during a routine traffic stop. She refused to comply and was obstructing my duties." The prosecutor didn't even blink. "Uncooperative," she repeated, her tone sharp. She turned toward the screen positioned at the front of the courtroom. "Your Honor, let's take a look at the body cam footage, shall we?" The bailiff dimmed the lights. The video began to play. The entire room watched in eerie silence. The footage showed Naomi calmly handing over her license and registration. It showed her politely questioning why she was pulled over. And then it showed Riggins escalating. The way he smirked. The way his voice dripped with condescension. The way he ripped Naomi from the car, twisted her wrists, and shoved her against the vehicle. Then, his final words before locking her in the patrol car, "Welcome to Jackson, sweetheart. Hope you like concrete beds." The courtroom collectively inhaled. Naomi didn't watch the footage. She had lived it. Instead, she watched the reactions. The judge's face hardened. His fingers steepled under his chin. His jaw tightened ever so slightly. The jury members exchanged uneasy glances. The reporters whispered furiously, pens scribbling against notepads, cameras clicking. And then, there was Riggins. His face was blank, but Naomi saw it. The twitch of his jaw. The way his hands clenched beneath the table. The way his shoulders lifted just slightly, as if bracing for impact. The footage ended. The prosecutor let the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Then, she picked up a thick folder from the table and strode toward the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice sharper now, cutting through the tension like a blade. She dropped the folder onto the desk with a loud thud. "Sergeant Riggins has been on the force for nearly a decade. In that time, he has conducted over 400 traffic stops. And of those, she flipped through the pages, over 78% of them involved black drivers." A ripple of shock spread through the courtroom. Gasps. Someone in the back muttered, "Jesus." The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Sergeant Riggins," he said slowly, deliberately, "do you have an explanation for this disturbing pattern?" Riggins shifted. His lawyer straightened, trying to speak, but Riggins lifted a hand, silent, tense. For a long moment, he said nothing. Because there was no explanation. Just silence. The weight of the truth pressing down on him. Judge Holloway exhaled, rubbing his temple. "Enough," he said, his voice laced with exhaustion. "Sergeant Riggins, the evidence against you is overwhelming. The body cam footage clearly demonstrates an abuse of power, and your record speaks for itself." Riggins' jaw tightened. His face was red now, anger, humiliation, maybe both. The judge turned toward Naomi. "Lieutenant Carter, I sincerely apologize for the treatment you endured. The charges against you are dismissed immediately." He slammed the gavel down. Naomi closed her eyes for just a second. Not in relief, she had always known she would win this fight, but in gratitude, because this wasn't just for her. This was for everyone who had come before her and never gotten justice. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled for their microphones. The jury exchanged looks as if they couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. And Riggins? Riggins was fuming. His hands clenched into fists. His breath came out sharp. And then, a voice from the back of the room. "Sergeant Riggins," someone called out. The room hushed. A man in a crisp suit stepped forward. Naomi recognized him immediately. Internal Affairs. "Sergeant Riggins," the man repeated, flipping through a folder of his own. "You are hereby placed on immediate suspension pending a full investigation into your conduct. Please turn over your badge and firearm." For the first time, Riggins looked scared. His lawyer turned to him, whispering urgently, but Riggins just sat there, frozen. His power was slipping through his fingers. The officer stepped forward. "Your badge, Sergeant," he repeated. Riggins stood slowly. His hand shook as he reached up and unpinned a silver badge from his chest. The courtroom watched in silence as he set it down on the table. It clinked against the wood, a sound that echoed far louder than it should. Naomi met his eyes one last time. This time, he looked away first. Naomi stepped outside, greeted by the blinding flashes of cameras, the hum of a restless crowd. People were chanting her name, but she knew this was just the beginning. Because for every corrupt officer taken down, there were a dozen more waiting. And Naomi Carter? She wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The courthouse steps were a sea of flashing cameras, microphones, and raised voices. The hum of the crowd was thick with anger, disbelief, and a thirst for justice. Reporters jostled for space, their questions blending into one chaotic mess of sound, while protesters packed the streets, holding signs that bore bold, defiant words. "End police abuse, justice for Naomi, and no more protection for racist cops." Naomi Carter stepped out onto the marble steps, her back straight, her face unreadable. She was no longer just an intelligence officer. She was now the face of a movement. The crowd erupted the moment she appeared. People chanted, clapped, raised their fists. A chant had started somewhere in the back, rippling through the people like wildfire. "Justice for Naomi. Justice for Naomi." Her heart pounded, but she refused to let it show. This wasn't about her. Not anymore. This was about every person who had been stopped, harassed, arrested, and never had a voice. Vanessa Grayson, the prosecutor, stood beside her, as did Naomi's lawyer. But all eyes were on her. She gripped the podium, leaned forward, and spoke. "They thought no one would care. I stand before you today not as a victim, but as a woman who refuses to be silenced." The crowd roared. Naomi let them have their moment before she continued. Every word measured. Every word a blade meant to cut through the lies. "They thought no one would care. That I would just be another name lost in the system. Another arrest that no one questioned. But they were wrong." A storm of applause followed. Cameras clicked wildly. What happened to me happens to people every single day. People who don't have a military rank. People who don't have a legal team or news cameras following their case. And far too often, those people do not get justice. The weight of those words settled over the crowd like a heavy rain. She continued, voice sharp as steel. "This is not just about me. This is about every black man, woman, and child who has been told their rights don't matter. This is about accountability. We will not stop. We will not back down. And we will not be afraid." More cheers. More claps. And somewhere, among the crowd of officials and politicians standing stiffly in the background, Mayor Andrew Whitmore shifted uncomfortably. The case had become too big to ignore. The press had torn into the Jackson Police Department, exposing years of misconduct, racial profiling, and internal cover-ups. The governor had issued a statement calling for a full and thorough review of the department's policies. But the public wasn't satisfied with vague promises. The mayor had no choice but to respond. Whitmore stepped up to the microphone, clearing his throat. He was a seasoned politician. He knew how to sound concerned without actually saying anything. "What happened to Lieutenant Carter is unacceptable," he said smoothly, gripping the sides of the podium. "The citizens of Jackson deserve a police force that upholds the law, not one that abuses it." The crowd wasn't impressed. A reporter called out, "Then why is Sergeant Riggins still on the force?" Whitmore hesitated. "Just for a second. Sergeant Riggins is currently under investigation by Internal Affairs, and appropriate action will be taken following their findings." The words were too polished, too rehearsed. Another voice shouted, "So how many other cops are like Riggins? How many more have been protected by your office?" Whitmore's jaw tightened. He had no answer for that, because everyone knew the truth. Riggins wasn't a lone wolf. He was part of a system, and if one thread was pulled too hard, the whole damn thing would unravel. The video of Naomi's arrest had gone viral. The footage of Riggins' disgrace in court had millions of views. And now, the internet had given it a name. #JusticeForNaomi. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. It was everywhere. Celebrities, activists, even politicians had weighed in. Calls for Riggins' immediate firing were blaring from every media outlet. Protests had spread beyond Jackson. People were marching in Atlanta. People were rallying in Chicago. For once, the system couldn't bury it. Naomi's case had ignited something unstoppable. That night, Naomi sat alone in her hotel room. The chaos outside was a distant hum, muffled by thick curtains and exhaustion. Her phone buzzed. She expected another news alert. Instead, she saw an anonymous message. "Drop this, or it gets worse." Her stomach turned. Naomi had spent her career in intelligence. She knew a threat when she saw one. She tightened her grip on the phone, jaw clenching. They were scared. Good. Naomi exhaled slowly, steadying herself. She wouldn't drop this. She wouldn't back down. Because if she did, the next woman, next man, next child, might not get another chance. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The governor's office loomed ahead like a fortress, its white stone exterior pristine and imposing. Naomi Carter had walked into high-stakes meetings before, wore briefings, intelligence debriefs, classified counterterrorism discussions, but this was different. This wasn't just a discussion. This was a battle against a system that had long thrived on silence, on cover-ups, on unchecked power. She adjusted her blazer, squared her shoulders, and strode through the glass doors. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, thick with unspoken words. Governor Charles Abbott sat at the head of the long mahogany conference table, surrounded by his advisors, the police commissioner, the attorney general, and Mayor Andrew Whitmore, whose expression looked carved from stone. The air was stiff with forced diplomacy, but Naomi didn't come here for pleasantries. She came for justice. "This isn't about me." Naomi didn't wait to be addressed. She had the floor, and she wasn't going to waste it. She leaned forward, hands pressed against the cool surface of the table. "I want to make something very clear." The room stilled. "This isn't about me." Naomi's voice was steady, but her words carried weight, sinking into the ears of everyone sitting in that office. "This is about every single person who came before me and never got justice. Every person who was pulled over, harassed, detained, or worse, and never got to tell their story because the system silenced them before they could." She let the silence stretch, let them feel the truth behind her words. Then she turned to Governor Abbott. "You sit here, comfortable, in a room full of men who are supposed to uphold the law. Meanwhile, people like me, people who look like me, have been terrorized by this state's law enforcement for generations. So tell me, Governor, what are you going to do about it?" The governor shifted in his chair, adjusting his tie. He had likely prepared for this meeting, ready with neutral, non-committal statements. But Naomi wasn't giving him an easy way out. He cleared his throat, his voice measured. "Lieutenant Carter, I understand your frustration." Naomi's gaze darkened. "With all due respect, you don't." The weight of the room tilted. The governor inhaled, steadying himself. "What happened to you is unacceptable," he conceded. "And the footage of your arrest has rightfully caused outrage. That is why I am promising a full statewide investigation into police corruption, starting with an independent review of the Jackson Police Department." The Attorney General nodded in agreement. "We'll be reviewing cases tied to officers flagged for racial profiling. And that includes Sergeant Riggins." Naomi didn't blink. She had heard promises before. She had seen politicians use outrage as a tool to save face, only to do nothing once the cameras turned away. She studied the governor carefully. "I don't want a promise," she said. "I want action." The governor met her eyes. For the first time, there was something more than discomfort there. There was fear. Because Naomi wasn't just another protester outside his window. She was in the room. And she wasn't backing down. The next morning, Naomi stood outside the Jackson Police Department, her hands shoved into her coat pockets as a chilling wind swept through the streets. The crowd had gathered again. The cameras were back. Something was happening. Then the doors opened. 2 internal affairs officers marched out, flanking a single man. Sergeant Kyle Riggins. His once pristine uniform was stripped of its badge, his firearm already confiscated. His face was twisted in rage, his hands bound behind his back in handcuffs, the same kind he had snapped onto Naomi's wrists just days before. He struggled as they led him down the steps, a public humiliation he never saw coming. The police chief stood at the podium, clearing his throat. The flash of cameras lit up the space around him. Effective immediately, Sergeant Kyle Riggins has been terminated from the Jackson Police Department. Additionally, the district attorney's office is filing criminal charges for falsifying police reports, excessive force, and wrongful arrest. The crowd erupted. The chants, the cheers, the vindication. Naomi watched from a distance. She wasn't the one smirking now. For once, Riggins' face was devoid of arrogance. Now he was just another man, stripped of the power he had abused for years. But Naomi knew. This wasn't the end. Because Riggins wasn't the only one. He was just the first domino to fall. That evening, Naomi sat in a quiet cafe downtown, watching as the news played on the television mounted on the wall. The headline flashed in bold: Sergeant Riggins fired and charged. Governor promises full investigation. The screen cut to the mayor, dodging questions about how deep the corruption ran. Then to the governor, assuring the public that change was coming. And then, to her, a clip of her speech outside the courthouse. Her face, calm but fierce. Naomi sighed, setting down her cup of coffee. Her phone buzzed. A message from Vanessa Grayson. "DOJ is watching. This might go federal. Are you ready?" Naomi exhaled, staring out the window at the city beyond. She had fought the first battle. But the war? That was just beginning. She picked up her phone. And she typed one word back. "Always." Naomi Carter stood her ground. She refused to be silenced. And because of that, a corrupt officer lost his badge, an investigation was launched, and a system built to protect itself was forced to answer for its crimes. But let's be honest, this isn't just Naomi's fight. How many stories just like hers never make it to the headlines? How many people have been harassed, arrested, brutalized, or even killed without a camera, without a courtroom, without justice? Too many. The reality is that the system doesn't change on its own. It only changes when people demand it, when the truth is exposed, when those in power are held accountable. And that can only happen when we refuse to look away. Naomi fought back, not just for herself, but for every person who has been a victim of racial injustice. She stood up, not knowing if anyone would listen, but in the end, her voice was heard. And that's what matters. But the fight isn't over. There are more Riggins out there. More corrupt officers. More mayors and governors who turn a blind eye. More people who believe their badge makes them untouchable. And that is why we cannot be silent. We must keep speaking up. We must keep exposing the truth. We must keep demanding justice. If Naomi's story made you feel angry, frustrated, or inspired, then don't just sit with that feeling. Use it. Hit that like button to show your support for Naomi and everyone who has been wrongfully targeted. Subscribe to this channel because this fight isn't over, and we're going to keep telling stories that matter. Turn on notifications so you never miss a video, because knowledge is power, and the more we learn, the stronger we become. We cannot change the past, but we can fight for a better future. And it starts right now. Are you ready? Then let's keep going.